I wanted to ask you, speaking of land and land development, in addition to transportation, one of the areas that you've written about, taught about a lot, studied in great detail has been land use and zoning in the city of Chicago and how those two things play together. We're at a moment right now nationally where a lot of major cities are starting to challenge a lot of the zoning that was implemented in mid-century, especially things like zoning most of the residential land in a city for single-family homes only. And cities like Minneapolis and Sacramento and even places like Boise, Idaho have all started to challenge those rules and allow the kinds of missing middle development, 2 to 4 unit apartment buildings that were previously illegal, look about allowing larger buildings than that along key corridors and those kinds of things. What do you think is pushing that change? Maybe a reversion to a more historic mean, if you could look at it that way? And how might that play out in Chicago as the third largest city in the country, which traditionally had a lot of that kind of missing middle development?
Oh, yeah. Topic dear to my heart. I mean, the institute that I direct is named after Harry Chaddick, who brought the city, in a way, modern zoning in 1957. And Harry knew pretty quickly by the mid-'60s they got some things right, they got some things wrong, which I'll explain in a minute. But you look back then, there was this fixation on sort of scientific land use. Like, this neighborhood needs to be residential, the street can be commercial, but that little corner store, that's got to go. And they couldn't technically get rid of it, but they could name it a non-conforming use. And the minute it shut down or there was some disruption, they couldn't reopen. The idea was to separate things and so forth. Now we look back and think those corner stores are kind of nice. People want to live somewhere where they can, walk down the street and grab a sandwich. And of course, residences want to be in a lot of these storefronts along the street because so much shopping has shifted online. So our zoning is trying to catch up with that. And two things really strike me about what you said. One is that concerns about noxious uses are just so different now. I mean, if you have a business next to you, he's not going to be burning coal at 4 o'clock in the morning to heat up his ovens.
Right.
It's okay to have that restaurant next to you and so forth. And secondly, there's all this fixation, understandably, about people working from home, that you could have one employee in your house, but you can't have two, and they can't. And now with Zoom, everybody works everywhere. And so I think we're seeing that we got to let these neighborhoods sort of go back to a little more of a relaxed approach toward land use. And you mentioned single-family homes. It's really unfortunate that zoning prevents us from redeveloping in a style that's a little more new urbanist, you might say, and we're catching up.
There's a piece you said about non-conforming uses, and something that's startling a lot of times looking at maps or data on the city is just how much of the city is non-conforming.
Right.
If you look at where currently, like, it's not alien to the neighborhood, there is currently a 2 to 4 unit apartment building there. But if it was torn down today, you could not legally build anything but a single family home. And large parts of the city as well that have a lot of vacant land where legally that is the only thing you can build. Twice as much land allocated to single family home only zoning as to anything else. My question for that is, it seems to me that if most of the city is non-conforming, that's a policy way of saying that most of the city was a mistake we shouldn't make again. And clearly, based on the neighborhoods where people like to live and people want to move to, that's not totally right. How do we make sense of that disparity between what the rules say and what the zoning says and the kinds of places where people seemingly want to live?
Yeah, no, it's been a back and forth process that I think when 20 years ago, the sense was, let's keep zoning fairly restrictive and developers can come and rezone. And you just need a public hearing and you got to do your homework. And this will give set up as a planned development, which requires a public hearing and a site plan and so forth. And that sounds great. But one, it's hard to get stuff done when you have all this red tape. But secondly, when you introduce a political element into this, you have public hearings, the alderman has more or less total say over this because of the automatic prerogative, so you have to keep the alderman happy. And it's very tough to get something done in a neighborhood that needs redevelopment, but people are scared of change. And so what do you mean you're going to tear down these single-family homes and put up 2 flats? Where'd this come from? What's in it for us? Is the developer going to give us a free park with those? And suddenly nothing happens. And I'm impressed at how the debates come along, and your organization's been part of that. The Metropolitan Planning Council's been drawing attention to this, that if we want more affordable housing, and I'm paraphrasing or giving my views, it's got to be more than having affordable housing requirements and subsidies. That needs to be part of it. But we also got to encourage developers to go out and build it just with their own funds. And so we've made a lot of mistakes where it's hard to get that done in neighborhoods that would like it because of, the developer just fears a 2-year process, 5 public hearings, and we're going to get beat up by the neighborhood. And the neighborhood, I think, just needs a little push to be a little more relaxed about this, and zoning's made that tough.
Mm-hmm. And especially because there's so little that can be done by right that, to your point, everything has to be an exception. And that makes it so that the only kinds of projects that are worth pursuing to the bitter end are the kinds of mega projects, or in a lot of cases, the kinds of luxury projects that people like to hate on so much. If you want to do anything that's smaller scale, there's no way it pencils out with that waiting process and that discretion built in.
Yeah, and since 30 years ago, household size is diminished. So when people see a 2-story building, the number of trips that they think that generates is often exaggerated because the data show that, families are smaller now. And when you say we're going to upzone, people right away think that you're opening the floodgates when it's really just bowing to some market reality. If you want new housing here, you got to let developers, do something besides single-family homes. And the sad part for our city in many ways is that we have a very, very good equitable TOD ordinance, Transit-Oriented Development Ordinance. And that's done some great things. I mean, you look at the northwest side and the north side, so many transit-friendly projects have happened. But to get more of those developments in other neighborhoods, you have to give developers a clear pathway where they're not going to get beat up in the process. And there's some work to do there.
Are there any changes you've seen that are promising, or things that we haven't seen yet but would go a long way in making it easier to build that scale of infill housing?
Yeah, I do think the city and interest groups are now seeing that we got to speed the development process up. Getting the approvals done faster is just really important. Speeding things up so developers can buy a piece of land and be confident in what's going to happen. I think, too, what we're finding is for bigger projects, parking minimums, the developer has an incentive to provide the right amount of parking, typically in consultation with the neighborhood and the alderman. That gets negotiated as part of the process. You don't necessarily need City Hall to set a high minimum parking. Maybe you set a base that's flexible, but then let it be given context specific. So if you're doing this in the South Loop, the developer may provide minimal parking, but if you're in a neighborhood that's got poor transit options, you push them to have more. So that's been a hurdle for developers. I also think, we just need more housing in the city, and it's just unfortunate that the trends have been, pretty scary in the last few years, that there just hasn't been much new housing built. And I talk to my students about what's happening to their rent. It just breaks your heart in some ways that they love the city, they live transit-oriented lifestyles, but those rents are going up and up because of that pressure. And boy, the supply has got to be part of the mix.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the story seems to be a lot of times on the south and west sides, a lot of demolitions, gradual demolitions, and on the north and northwest sides, a lot of deconversions.
Yes, I mean, you take a 2-flat, you make it a house, that's one less unit, and you don't want to be overly punitive about people wanting to take old properties and fix them up. But we have seen, along the 606 and others, a lot of that effect. And zoning has a hard time with that because it's usually floor area ratios and things like that, and less about the type and affordability of housing, which zoning doesn't cover so much. And those deconversions, de-densify the neighborhood too. So the coffee house nearby has fewer credit card swipes and so forth.
Less footfall.
And transit, the TOD ordinance, though, has some great things to incentivize that. That if you do affordable housing, we can lower your parking requirements, so forth. And we're seeing now interest in the South, but the pace of new construction for housing is just quite low right now.
Mm-hmm. Is there something that you think advocates, folks who are interested in this, folks who love Chicago, want to stay here long term, and want it to be affordable for them and their families, what are a couple of specific things they could do, either from an advocacy standpoint or on getting informed and learning about, to be able to push towards that goal?
Yeah, I mean, just understanding how the process works. And I joke that I try to avoid using the word zoning when I discuss urban principles because they think this is a legal, dry thing. And I show my students how you can get on, second city zoning of the site that makes it easy and it's color coded. You can pretty quickly understand now how this all works. What is this public hearing coming up? Oh, it's a planned development. That means we're going to negotiate. So people can be brought up from a 2 out of 10 to a 7 out of 10 pretty quick. And we're also seeing aldermen now, I think, recognize that their constituents are much better informed than they used to be. So the level of discussion about developments, I've been impressed, is going up too, where they're talking about parking units per unit, FAR, those kind of things. But I will say, most people aren't like you and me that really care how the sausage is made. So it's you got to make it interesting for them.
Right. So that it's not an academic thing. It has grounding in what they see in their neighborhood.
Yeah. I see a sign on my neighborhood. They're going to rezone to, R3. I can get online, see what that is. I can look what the neighbors' houses are. And I don't just have to read viral posts about it. I can do my own research on this. And it's, with the internet, of course, got so much easier for that. I think a little bit harder for people is to keep track of the politics of City Hall, because as we know, things are pretty turbulent right now.
Right.
And even I have trouble understanding who's the mayor, what kind of projects is he going to expend political capital on, which ones aren't. That's a bit of a volatile situation right now, you might say.
Right. Even some incremental reforms like extending the ADU, accessory dwelling unit, policy to allow people to do basement conversions or add backyard cottages. That seemed to have a lot of momentum, and it's basically stalled for the past year, which has been frustrating for some advocates. But what are some ways for people to make the case to their officials, to their aldermen and other folks, that this is an important incremental reform? Yeah.
Accessory dwelling units are fascinating because with the stroke of a pen, you can suddenly free things up, and it's the neighbors can see that this isn't going to lead to 15 cars coming out of that house. It's like one bedroom above this garage, or whatever. So we think that's really low-hanging fruit. We also think that recognizing there's so much of the city, like the far southeast side and so forth, which is just so much vacant land, if we can find ways to get developers interested in taking a chance on those neighborhoods, and things like extending the red line, improving a metro can be part of that mix, because unfortunately a lot of people just don't just see the enormity of the city and how we have lots of room to do interesting stuff if we can make it happen.